Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into its weight. Allow your breathing to even out. There is no destination to reach tonight, no arrival to consider. The journey has already slowed. The path will carry itself. When you are ready, we begin. Tonight's story is called A Long, Pale Promenade Beneath a Widening Sky. The promenade stretches ahead in a pale ribbon of stone, its surface faintly worn by years of passing footsteps, and the quiet insistence of salt carried in from the sea. It does not gleam. It holds light the way chalk holds sunlight, softly, without shine, without glare. To one side, the water moves in long, measured breaths. To the other, low buildings stand in patient rows, their windows dimmed for the evening, their shutters drawn in colors faded by sun and wind. The air carries that familiar mixture of salt and stone, mineral, clean, faintly cool. You are already walking, not quickly, not slowly. The pace seems to find itself without your involvement. Your shoes meet the ground in a muted rhythm, a soft tap softened further by distance and open air. The sound does not echo. It settles into the wide space around you. The sky above has begun its gradual widening. Late light stretches thin across it, thinning the blue into something almost silver at the horizon. There are no sharp edges in this hour. Even the line where sea meets sky seems less definite, as though the two have agreed to blur their boundary. A breeze moves across the promenade. It is not strong. It travels steadily, carrying with it the faint scent of tide water and the memory of warmth stored in stone throughout the day. As it passes, it shifts the collar at your neck by the smallest degree, then moves on. A bench sits a short distance ahead, painted once in white, though now the paint has lifted in small, irregular patches. On the backrest near the right corner, a faint scratch cuts through the surface, revealing wood beneath. It is not recent. It has been there long enough to darken slightly, softened by weather and time. You pass it without stopping. The sea continues its steady rhythm, folding toward shore and easing back again. There is something reassuring about water that knows exactly how far it will travel. It does not hesitate. It does not hurry. It reaches, then returns. Farther along, a lamppost stands unlit, its glass housing catching the last thin threads of daylight. For now, it simply holds its place. Evening has not yet asked it to glow. The promenade widens slightly where it curves around a gentle bend. Here, the stone underfoot feels smoother. Countless steps have passed this way. The surface has been worn into a softness that does not show, only feels. Your stride adjusts by a fraction as you move over it without thought. The sky continues to open. Clouds drift high and thin, stretched into long, pale strands that seem to lengthen as you watch them. They are not moving quickly enough to notice, and yet their shapes alter by degrees, rounding at the edges, thinning at the center. You inhale. Salt lingers at the back of the breath. Cool air settles lower in the lungs than it did an hour ago. The day has begun its quiet turning, though nothing announces it directly. It simply adjusts the light until you realize the adjustment has already happened. A gull crosses overhead, not crying out, simply gliding with its wings held steady. Its shadow passes briefly over the pale stone, then dissolves into brightness. The movement leaves no trace. You continue along the curve. To your left, the sea darkens by a shade. Not abruptly, just enough that the surface begins to reflect more sky than light. Small ripples travel inward from deeper water, touching the edge of the promenade's low barrier before slipping back into the larger body. The barrier itself bears marks of weather, faint streaks where rain once traveled downward, subtle discoloration where metal met stone, and left behind a memory of rust. Nothing here is pristine. Everything here is quietly maintained by use. A door closes somewhere behind you, not loudly, just a distant, softened click carried on air. The sound travels briefly, then thins into space. You do not turn. The promenade continues to extend ahead, straightening now after its curve. The openness increases. Buildings recede slightly, giving way to a broader sweep of sky. The horizon feels farther away, though it has not moved. There is space enough here for thoughts to widen without becoming loud. Your steps continue at the same measured cadence. Stone, breath, sea. Stone, breath, sea. The wind lifts again, this time carrying the faintest hint of something cooling, perhaps bread from a nearby kitchen, perhaps simply the scent of warmth leaving stone as evening lowers. It is subtle enough that you are not certain. It passes before you can decide. A low wall runs alongside the promenade now, its surface smooth beneath your palm as you rest your hand there for a moment. The stone holds a trace of retained heat, though it is fading. The warmth does not resist the cool air. It yields gradually. You walk on. The sky lightens at its highest point, becoming almost translucent where it stretches overhead. Toward the horizon, it deepens into a pale band of lavender gray. The shift is so slight it feels imagined, yet it continues. There is no destination here, only continuation. Another bench appears ahead, this one angled slightly toward the sea. Its slats are darker, perhaps newer, though already touched by salt. You notice a small dent worn smooth at the edge of one seat where countless hands have pressed to stand. The mark has rounded over time, polished by repetition. You pass it as well. The promenade is neither crowded nor empty. It simply exists. A pair of figures far in the distance move at their own unhurried pace, their outlines softened by evening air. Their presence does not alter the space. It remains wide, open, gently expansive. Above, the first faint star becomes visible, not bright yet, just a small point holding its place against the thinning blue. It does not demand attention. It simply remains. You breathe again. The air settles more deeply now. The rhythm of your steps aligns with the steady pull of tide against stone. The promenade continues beneath you, pale and patient, extending forward in quiet invitation. Nothing urges you onward. Nothing asks you to stop. The sky widens still. The color shifts again by such a small degree that it feels like a private adjustment made just above your line of sight. The blue thins toward the west, becoming almost weightless, while farther out over the water, it deepens into a muted slate that gathers itself quietly. A railing begins along the stretch of promenade, slender iron bars spaced evenly, their tops cool beneath your fingertips as you trail your hand across them. The metal carries the evening more quickly than stone does. It has already surrendered the day's warmth. Your steps remain even. The tide has begun its subtle return. The line of wet sand below the barrier darkens, widening by inches that only the patient would notice. Water slides inward in long, shallow arcs, then retreats, leaving behind a faint shimmer that catches the last of the light. There is something steady about that pattern. It does not compete with the sky, it simply answers it. Farther along, a small kiosk stands closed for the evening, its wooden shutters drawn, but not latched tightly. A thin ribbon of light escapes through the narrow seam between panels, faint and amber against the cooling air. It does not reach the ground. It remains contained within its own small frame. You continue past it. There is a softness to this hour that cannot be rushed. Even the wind seems to travel more thoughtfully, moving across the surface of the water and up along the promenade in a way that feels measured rather than forceful. It brushes your sleeve, then slips away toward the buildings. You notice the sound of your own breathing more clearly now, not amplified, just more distinct against the widening quiet. Inhale, exhale. The air carries a slight dampness from the tide, settling low and cool. A single bicycle rests against the railing ahead, its frame angled slightly as though placed there without urgency. One wheel turns by the smallest degree in the breeze before slowing again. It makes no sound. The movement is barely perceptible, but it completes itself fully before becoming still. The horizon stretches wider still. Clouds thin to delicate veils near the edges, dissolving into pale streaks that feel less like shapes and more like suggestions of movement. They do not gather into drama. They remain spacious, open, undemanding. There is something about a wide sky at this hour that allows the body to settle more deeply into itself. It does not ask you to look up constantly. It does not insist. It simply exists above you, expansive and patient. The stone beneath your feet changes texture slightly smoother here, as though rain has polished it over years. Your step adjusts without thought. The cadence continues. A distant buoy sounds once from far out in the water. The tone is low, rounded, carried thinly across the surface before fading into distance. It is not a sharp sound. It feels almost absorbed by the open air as it travels. You do not count it. You do not anticipate the next. The promenade widens again near a gentle overlook where the barrier dips lower. From here, the water feels closer. The surface shifts in soft lines that reflect more sky than sea, holding pale streaks of lavender and fading gold. The light rests on the water briefly before being drawn back into it. You pause for a moment, though it is not a deliberate stop. Your steps simply slow of their own accord. The air carries the faint scent of seaweed drying along rocks below, mineral, briny, edged with something earthy. It is not strong enough to dominate. It lingers, then thins. Somewhere behind you, a hinge gives a soft sigh as a door settles fully into its frame. The sound is so slight it might have been imagined, but it completes itself fully before the quiet returns. You resume walking. The first lamppost along the straight stretch flickers once before steadying into a muted glow. The light is warm but restrained, forming a small circle on the stone beneath it. It does not reach far. It holds its own space without pressing outward. One by one, along the curve behind you, other lamps begin their quiet illumination. No grand transition, just small pools of light appearing along the pale path. There is something reassuring about that, how evening arrives through a series of small adjustments rather than a single change. The sea continues its slow return toward shore. The edge of wet sand widens again, darkening as water eases across it. The sound remains low and constant, a gentle layering beneath your steps. Above, the sky shifts toward deeper blue, though a thin ribbon of light still lingers along the horizon. It stretches wide, softening at its edges. The first star brightens slightly, joined now by another, faint but present. Your shoulders lower by a fraction. The promenade does not end abruptly. It extends forward in steady measure, pale stone guiding the eye along its quiet line. The buildings to your right feel more distant now, their windows dimming fully as interior lights settle into evening. A faint breeze lifts once more, carrying the memory of warmth from stone that is nearly cooled. It moves past your cheek and continues outward over the water, leaving no disturbance behind. Your steps align again with tide and breath. Stone, breath, sea. The sky widens once more before deepening, as though the space above you is stretching into its full evening shape. It does not close in. It expands, then rests. You continue walking along the long, pale promenade beneath that widening sky, already held within its quiet scale. The rhythm begins without announcement. It is not introduced as a task. It simply forms, step after step, breath after breath, tide after tide. Your walking settles into a pattern that does not require attention to maintain itself. The promenade stretches ahead in a long, pale arc that follows the contour of the shoreline. The stone carries a faint residual warmth in places where it absorbed more sun during the day, but that warmth now thins gradually into the cooler evening air. You feel the difference beneath the soles of your shoes without needing to name it. Ahead, a row of low benches lines the curve of the path. Their wood is weathered to a soft gray, edges rounded by years of salt air, and hands resting in passing. One bench holds a faint indentation in the center slat, worn smoother than the rest, where countless people have sat and leaned back, looking out at the same widening sky. You do not sit, not yet. The tide continues its slow inward reach. Each wave travels in, slides across sand, then eases back with a quiet withdrawal that feels less like retreat and more like recalibration. There is something patient in that repetition. It does not hurry itself forward. A thin channel of water begins to trace along the edge of the shore, forming a shallow, reflective ribbon between sand and sea wall. It mirrors the sky in fragments, broken streaks of pale light and deepening blue before shifting again. Your steps remain steady. Somewhere to your right, beyond the line of buildings, a door closes softly. Not abrupt, just a gentle click followed by the faintest shuffle of movement inside. The world behind the promenade begins to turn inward for the night, while the open horizon remains wide and uncontained. There's something about a shoreline at dusk that feels complete in itself. It does not need decoration. It does not need explanation. It holds enough movement, enough stillness to sustain attention without effort. You pass beneath another lamppost. Its glow falls in a circular pool at your feet, then slips away as you move through it. Light, shadow, light again. The pattern repeats along the curve. The sea has taken on a darker tone now. Not black, not opaque, but deeper and more reflective. Small ripples carry faint glints from the remaining band of brightness at the horizon. The surface looks almost metallic in places, then softens again as wind shifts. A gull calls once overhead, the sound stretching briefly before dissolving into the open air. It does not repeat. Your breathing aligns easily with the rhythm of walking. Inhale across 3 or 4 steps. Exhale across the next. It does not need to be exact. It simply finds its level. The promenade narrows slightly near a set of low steps that descend toward a small sandy inlet. The steps are stone as well, though more worn than the flat path above. A faint scuff marks the edge of one tread smooth where feet have landed over years of descent. You glance toward the inlet. Water gathers there in a shallow curve, folding inward around a cluster of dark rocks. The tide brushes against them and recedes, leaving a thin lace of foam that dissolves quietly into the sand. You remain on the upper path. The air cools another degree, not enough to demand a jacket, just enough to register along your forearms as a reminder that the day has moved on. A small fishing boat rests farther out beyond the buoy line, its hull gently rising and settling with the swell. No motor runs, no voices carry from it. It moves in response to water alone, nothing more. There's something reassuring about objects that respond only to the elements around them. They do not resist, they adjust. Your steps carry you toward a long, straight stretch where the promenade opens into its widest view. The railing here is lower, allowing the horizon to sit fully in your line of sight. The last of the sun's color has thinned to a faint silver wash across the far edge of the world. Even the buildings behind you seem to quiet further. Windows glow softly, but remain contained within their frames. No music drifts outward. No raised conversation spills into the open. The only steady sound now is the tide and the soft contact of your steps against stone. Step, breath, step. The rhythm settles deeper. A single lamplight ahead flickers slightly before steadying. Not dramatic, just a brief adjustment as current finds balance. The glow resumes its calm circle across the path. You walk through it. The sky deepens by another shade, though the first stars have not yet multiplied. They remain sparse, scattered carefully across the high expanse. The horizon line softens further, blurring where sea meets sky. The wide space above you feels larger now, not because it has grown, but because the light has thinned enough to reveal its full scale. There's a kind of relief in that openness. No ceiling, no enclosure, just air extending outward without demand. Your steps continue along the curve, guided by the steady geometry of the stone path. The tide shifts slightly closer to shore again, its edge brushing nearer the base of the sea wall. The breeze settles briefly. For a moment, the promenade holds its shape in near stillness, light suspended, water leveled, air resting between movements. Then the tide slides forward once more, and the rhythm resumes. You walk on, already carried within it. The promenade continues without interruption, and your steps remain easy within it. A low stone wall curves gently along the inland side of the path, separating the open shoreline from a line of quiet terraces set slightly higher. Their doors are closed now, curtains drawn across tall windows that once faced the sun. A faint warmth lingers in the masonry, stored from earlier hours, easing outward into the evening air. You pass a small alcove built into the wall, a shallow recess with a single wooden seat fixed into its curve. The wood has darkened where hands have rested over time, the grain polished smoother in the center than along the edges. There is a small, almost invisible notch near one corner of the seat, not damage, just a place where the surface yielded slightly to repeated pressure. It has been worn down to softness. You notice it without stopping. The tide shifts again. A broader wave moves inward, reaching further along the sand before thinning and sliding back. The sound it makes is low and even less crash than hush, like fabric being drawn carefully across a floor. Your pace adjusts subtly to the widening sound, not faster, not slower, just aligned. Somewhere along the rail ahead, a length of rope taps lightly against metal in the breeze. The sound repeats once, then rests. Then once again, small, contained. It does not intrude on the quiet, it becomes part of it. There's something grounding about these minor adjustments, rope against rail, water against stone, light against glass. Each movement finds its own boundary and settles within it. The sky now carries a thin gradient from pale silver at the horizon to deeper indigo above. The transition is gradual enough that you cannot pinpoint where one shade becomes another. It simply rounds into itself. You continue walking. A pair of distant footsteps sounds briefly behind you, then fades as their rhythm turns inland at a side path. The promenade resumes its earlier emptiness without ceremony. Your breath lengthens slightly. A shallow pool left by the rising tide gathers near the edge of the walkway, its surface smooth enough to reflect the first clearer star overhead. The reflection trembles when a small ripple passes through, then steadies again. You watch it for a moment as you pass. There's no need to linger. The image has already imprinted itself, water holding sky in miniature, before letting it go. The breeze returns, brushing lightly across your collar and moving onward without resistance. It does not carry strong salt now, only a faint coolness that feels clean and unclaimed. Your steps remain even. The promenade bends gently left again, following the contour of the land. Farther ahead, the lamplight grows warmer against the cooling air, forming a series of soft halos that stretch into the distance. You move toward them without intention. The rhythm has already chosen its pace. The curve of the promenade carries you naturally toward the first of the lamps. Its light does not spill harshly. It gathers beneath the glass, then lowers in a quiet circle across the paving stones. The surface glows rather than shines, as though the evening itself has leaned closer to see more clearly. You step into that circle without pause. The stone beneath your feet holds a faint memory of warmth, stored from the day and now thinning into the air. It eases upward through the soles of your shoes, subtle, barely there, and then it fades. Nothing clings to it, nothing insists. A bench rests beneath the lamp, positioned to face the water. The wood is pale where the light reaches it, and darker at the edges where shadow settles. Along one slat, a faint scuff runs diagonally, not damage, simply a mark left by time. It has softened over years of contact. You notice it without needing to interpret it. A small gull calls once from farther down the shore. Then silence resumes. You continue walking. The tide has edged closer now, the distance between promenade and water narrowing with each quiet advance. Where earlier there was broad sand, now there are only long, smooth stretches that reflect the lamp's glow in fractured lines. Each wave arrives with a slow fold, spreading outward and then gathering itself again. It does not hurry. It does not hesitate. It simply completes its motion. There's something reassuring about water that knows its direction. Your steps follow the same principle. One foot lowers, then the other. The movement rounds into itself without analysis. A narrow staircase descends from the promenade to the sand below. The railing beside it is cool metal, slightly dulled by salt air. At its base, the water laps gently against the lowest step, rising and receding with soft regularity. You do not descend. The stairs exist as an option only. The rhythm remains here, on the level path. A second lamp glows ahead, its halo overlapping faintly with the first. The space between them is darker, but not empty. The air in that stretch feels slightly cooler, the breeze unobstructed by light. You pass through it easily. The sea shifts tone as the sky deepens. The earlier silver has thinned into muted slate, and the horizon line blurs until it is no longer distinct. Sea and sky share the same quiet register now. A small fishing boat rocks near the far edge of the inlet, tethered by a line that lifts and lowers with the tide. The rope tightens briefly, then relaxes, tightens again, then settles. You watch the motion once. It continues whether you observe it or not. The promenade widens slightly near a stone archway that frames a narrow street inland. The arch holds its own pool of shadow beneath it, and from within that shadow comes the faintest sound of a door closing somewhere farther up the street. Contained, distant, complete, your breathing remains steady. You notice that your shoulders have lowered without instruction. The evening air has a way of encouraging that. It does not demand stillness, it offers it. A thin ribbon of cloud drifts across the upper sky, barely visible except where it crosses the brighter edge of a rising star. The cloud thins as it moves, dissolving into open dark. You continue forward. Another bench appears, this one angled slightly away from the water, facing both sea and promenade. The angle allows for watching movement in either direction. A small crease in the wood near one corner suggests that someone once rested there often enough to leave an imprint. You do not need to sit to feel the stillness it holds. A light breeze returns, carrying a subtle change in scent, less salt now, more cool stone and faint greenery from terraces inland. The shift is minor but noticeable. Evening gathers its layers quietly. You pass beneath another lamp. Its light catches briefly on the railing beside you, creating a thin line of brightness that travels along the metal before fading into shadow. The reflection lasts only a second. Then it is gone. There is no need to hold it. Somewhere out across the water, a buoy releases a single muted chime as it rocks against its tether. The sound is low, rounded, and brief. It does not echo. It simply enters the air and then dissolves into the wider hush. You feel the sound more than hear it. Your pace remains consistent. The promenade now stretches longer between bends, offering a wider view of the inlet. The tide has risen enough to erase most of the earlier footprints along the sand. The surface appears newly smoothed, as though no one has crossed it before. There's something quiet about that, the way water erases without announcement. You walk beside it without leaving much mark yourself. The sky deepens another shade. Lights begin to appear in distant windows along the opposite shore, small points suspended in darkening facades. They glow steadily, neither bright nor dim, simply present. You do not count them, you continue. The rhythm of your steps aligns with the rhythm of the tide, though not precisely. There is variation. Sometimes your foot lowers as the water recedes. Sometimes it lowers as the water reaches forward. The two movements overlap without needing to synchronize perfectly. It is enough that they coexist. A narrow stretch of railing curves inward slightly, forming a sheltered pocket along the path. The breeze softens there, and the air feels momentarily warmer. You pass through it without altering your pace. The sheltered space releases you back into open air just as easily. Ahead, the promenade narrows toward another gentle bend. The lamps grow more distant now, their halos stretching thinner across the stone. The space between them feels larger. Your breath deepens again, not because you ask it to, but because the evening has lowered its volume. The tide continues to rise. The promenade continues to curve. You continue walking within it, and everything that moves, water, light, rope, air, settles into its own quiet measure, carrying the rhythm forward without needing to be directed. The promenade bends gently, and with that bend, something in the atmosphere shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that demands attention. The curve simply alters the relationship between sea and sky, bringing a wider sweep of water into view while narrowing the stretch of town behind you. The lamps thin out slightly here. The spaces between them lengthen. Darkness rests more comfortably along the railings. Your steps continue at the same measured pace. There is no need to adjust. The tide has risen enough now that the water reaches closer to the stone wall below the promenade. Each wave folds inward, touches the base, and recedes with a low, rounded hush. The sound is steady, but never identical. Some waves spread thin. Others gather more fully before easing back. The repetition does not feel like looping. It feels like breathing. You pass beneath another lamp, and its glow traces the curve of the railing in a soft arc. The metal holds the light briefly, then releases it. Your shadow lengthens along the paving stones, and then narrows again as you move beyond the halo. There is something quietly reassuring about shadows that change without resistance. The air cools another degree, not sharply, just enough that you notice your collar brushing lightly against your neck. The breeze carries the faint scent of kelp, softened by distance and diluted by open water. Your shoulders remain lowered. You reach a section of promenade where the stone underfoot changes texture. The earlier paving gives way to broader slabs, worn smooth in places and slightly uneven at their seams. One slab carries a faint line running across it, a hairline crack that has settled rather than widened. It holds its place without spreading. You step across it without altering your rhythm. The sea appears darker now, its surface reflecting less of the remaining light and holding more of the sky's deepening tone. Where earlier the water gleamed silver, it now gathers into a low blue-black, rounded at the edges by the tide's steady motion. A small ripple reaches toward the wall and meets it with a sound like fabric brushing against stone. Then it retreats. Your breathing aligns again with the slow pattern of the waves. Not perfectly synchronized, but close enough that the two rhythms feel companionable. There's a kind of steadiness in water that keeps returning. You notice the promenade widening slightly near a lookout point. A curved section of railing opens outward, offering an unobstructed view across the inlet. The lamps here are set farther back, allowing the sky to hold more presence. You pause for a moment, not stopping fully, just allowing your pace to soften. The horizon is less defined now. Sea and sky share a single muted tone, separated only by subtle shifts in texture. A distant buoy blinks faintly once, then dims again. Its light is small and contained, barely interrupting the larger quiet. You watch it for a breath, then you move on. The path narrows again beyond the lookout, returning to its earlier width. The stone beneath your feet carries a faint sheen of moisture where the air has settled more heavily. It does not feel slippery. It simply reflects a thinner ribbon of lamp glow as you pass. Your foot lowers, then the other. The rhythm remains unforced. Somewhere behind you, farther back along the promenade, a door closes with a muted thud. The sound is distant enough that it blends quickly into the broader hush. Nothing in your pace changes. Evening rarely announces itself. It simply adjusts the light until you notice it has already arrived. You pass a narrow set of steps descending toward a small landing closer to the water. A short rope barrier hangs loosely across the top, secured by two worn posts. The rope dips slightly in the middle, suggesting it has been lifted and lowered many times before. You do not approach it. The tide continues its gradual ascent without invitation. The lamps now glow more distinctly against the darkening sky, their halos softer at the edges. Each pool of light becomes its own contained space, a quiet island along the path. You move from one to the next without urgency, crossing through shadow and light in even intervals. The shadow does not feel empty. It feels like rest between breaths. The sea's sound deepens slightly as the water meets the stone wall more fully. The earlier whisper becomes a lower murmur. Still calm, still rounded, just fuller now. You feel the change in tone rather than volume. A small fishing skiff drifts gently near the edge of the inlet, tethered by a line that moves with the tide's rise. The boat tilts subtly, then levels, then tilts again. The rope draws taut for a moment, then relaxes. The pattern repeats without strain. You do not count the repetitions, you simply notice them. The promenade curves once more, revealing a longer stretch ahead. The lamps thin further here, spaced wider apart, allowing the night to hold more of the scene. The water reflects only fragments of their glow, thin streaks that ripple and dissolve with each small wave. Your breathing deepens again, not because you instruct it to, because the evening has lowered its tone. You reach a section where the stone wall dips slightly, offering a lower vantage toward the water. The tide has nearly reached its midpoint along the wall's height. Small lines of foam gather briefly at the base before smoothing out again. There is something calming about patterns that never demand completion. You continue walking. The breeze shifts direction, brushing more directly across your face now. It carries less salt and more cool openness. Your skin registers the change and then settles around it. A faint star brightens overhead. It does not flicker dramatically. It simply becomes more visible as the sky darkens around it. For a moment, it appears to rest directly above the waterline, balanced between sea and sky. You do not search for others. One is enough. The path beneath your feet feels increasingly familiar, though you have not counted the distance traveled. The rhythm of your steps has settled into something consistent and even. There is no destination in mind. The promenade itself provides its own continuity. You pass another bench, this one positioned slightly closer to the railing. The wood carries a subtle indentation near one end, a place where someone may have rested often, their weight gradually shaping the grain. The mark is softened, not pronounced. It holds memory without announcing it. You move beyond it. The tide continues to gather height, reaching farther along the wall. The sound grows fuller but never louder. Each wave spreads thinly, touches stone, and then eases away again. Your breath follows. There's something steady about repetition that does not strain. The lamps behind you now glow smaller as distance increases. Ahead, the remaining lamps appear like quiet markers along the curve of the shore. You move toward them without altering your pace. A faint metallic tap echoes once from somewhere near the railing, perhaps a loose ring brushing against its post in the breeze. The sound is contained, barely carrying beyond a few feet. Then it disappears. Your shoulders remain lowered. The air grows cooler still, but not sharply. The change is gradual, like the lowering of a dimmer rather than the switch of a light. The sky now holds more depth than color, its earlier blue settling into a muted charcoal. The sea mirrors it. For a moment, the horizon seems to vanish entirely, replaced by a continuous field of darkened tone. Water and sky meet without visible seam. You walk within that quiet blending. There is no need to separate one from the other. Your steps continue, even, unhurried, rounded. The tide continues to rise, even, unhurried, rounded. And somewhere within that shared rhythm, the boundary between movement and observation begins to soften, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough that you no longer feel entirely outside the scene. You are walking beside the water, and you are within its measure. The promenade carries you forward, but there is no sense of progression, only continuity. The curve of the shore unfolds slowly, revealing more darkened water, more lamps thinning into the distance, more open sky settling above. The night gathers, not quickly, just thoroughly, and your steps remain steady within it. The curve of the promenade carries you farther along the inlet, and the rhythm of your steps continues without interruption. The tide has risen enough now that the water meets the stone wall with a fuller, more confident reach. Each wave folds inward, presses lightly against the base, and then thins away again. There is no urgency in the movement. The sea is not arriving anywhere. It is simply continuing. Your breathing finds that same pattern, not because you guide it there, but because repetition has a way of inviting alignment. Inhale, a soft contact of water against stone. Exhale, the slow retreat. The two rhythms do not need to match perfectly. They only need to coexist. A lamplight ahead flickers once, not sharply, just a faint tremor in its filament before it steadies again. The glow returns to its rounded halo, resting against the paving stones and railing without strain. You notice it, and then you let it settle. The space between lamps widens again, allowing the darker intervals to hold more presence. The shadows here feel less like absence and more like depth. Your steps move through them without hesitation. There's something comforting about a path that does not change its intention. You pass a small iron mooring ring embedded in the wall, its surface worn smooth where rope has pulled against it for years. A faint crescent of lighter metal shows where friction has polished it slightly brighter than the rest. It holds its place without commentary. You brush your fingers lightly across the top of the wall as you walk. The stone feels cool, but not cold, holding the day's warmth just beneath its surface. For a moment, your hand and the stone share the same temperature, and the boundary between them feels less distinct. You withdraw your hand, and the sensation lingers. The tide reaches higher. It gathers, touches, and falls away. The sound has deepened into something rounder now, a low, continuous hush layered beneath the lighter ripples that skim along the surface. If you listen closely, you can hear the subtle variation within each wave. The thin scatter of foam, the brief suction as water releases from stone, the small, almost imperceptible eddy that curls at the edge. You do not analyze it. You simply allow the pattern to exist. A gull calls once from somewhere beyond the curve of the inlet. The sound is soft and distant, carried across water and thinned by space. It does not break the quiet, it becomes part of it. Then there is only the tide again. Your steps continue, measured, even. The promenade widens into another small lookout area, this one edged with a low semicircular wall. You move toward it without consciously deciding to. The stone underfoot shifts slightly in color here, darker near the edge where moisture has settled. You rest your hands lightly against the curve of the wall and look outward. The water fills more of your field of vision now. The far shore is only faintly visible, its outlines softened by distance and the lowering light. A single window glows dimly across the inlet, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. It does not draw you in, it simply exists. You remain for a few breaths. The tide continues to rise. You step away from the lookout and return to the narrower path. The railing resumes its quiet parallel line beside you, guiding without directing. A faint scuff marks one section of the metal where something once struck it lightly. The mark has dulled with time, its edges smoothed by weather. It holds a memory without insisting on it. Your breathing deepens slightly. There is something about water at night that encourages lengthened breath. Perhaps it is the steady repetition. Perhaps it is the absence of sharp edges in the sound. The sea does not demand your attention. It invites it gently. Another wave reaches the wall and spreads thinly across the lower stones. For a moment, the water lingers, held by surface tension before it slips back again. The retreat is unhurried. Nothing in this scene rushes toward completion. You walk on. The sky has darkened enough now that the first stars hold more clarity. They appear one by one, not in a sudden reveal, but in a gradual emergence. A faint cluster gathers higher above the horizon, their light softened by the thin veil of evening haze. You do not search for constellations. You allow the stars to be small. A distant buoy blinks again, a quiet pulse against the dark water. Its rhythm is slow and consistent, separated by long intervals of darkness. You wait through one full cycle without realizing you are waiting. The light returns, then fades. You move forward once more, the soles of your shoes brushing lightly against the stone. The sound is subtle, a muted contact that blends into the broader hush. A bench appears ahead, positioned slightly farther back from the railing than the others. Its wooden slats are darker with age, the grain raised slightly along the edges where hands have rested. A faint indentation marks the center of the seat, a place where weight has gathered over time. You do not sit, you simply notice. There's something quietly reassuring about objects that have been used gently. The tide has reached a higher line along the wall now. The earlier dry stones near the base are submerged, their color deepened beneath the surface. The water presses and releases in the same patient rhythm, as if testing nothing and proving nothing. It simply continues. Your shoulders loosen another fraction. You did not realize they were holding anything. The promenade curves again, and with that curve, the horizon shifts slightly. The water appears broader here, the inlet opening into a wider expanse beyond the headland. The lamps are fewer now, their glow dimmer against the deepening sky. You walk into the darker stretch without hesitation. The shadow feels thicker, but not heavier. It feels like depth. The breeze brushes more steadily along your cheek. It carries the faint scent of salt and something cooler, perhaps the open water beyond the inlet. Your collar lifts slightly, then settles again. A small ripple reaches higher than the others, touching a seam in the stone and retreating with a soft, hollow sound. The echo lingers for a moment in the curve of the wall, then it fades. You realize that your steps have slowed slightly, though you have not instructed them to. The promenade does not require a destination. The movement itself is enough. There's a kind of steadiness in walking without aim. Another star brightens overhead, not dramatically, just enough that it becomes distinct from the surrounding dark. The sky is no longer blue. It has deepened into something quieter, almost velvety in tone. The sea reflects none of it directly now. It holds its own darkness, textured by the subtle movement of the tide. You pass beneath a final lamp in this stretch, its light warmer than the others. For a moment, the glow touches your hands and sleeves, giving them a faint golden edge before releasing them back into shadow. The warmth is brief. It is enough. Beyond this lamp, the promenade narrows further, edging closer to the stone wall. The sound of water grows slightly louder, not in volume, but in proximity. Each wave seems nearer, more present. You place your palm lightly against the wall once more. The stone feels cooler now, the warmth of the day nearly gone. Beneath your hand, the faint vibration of water against the base travels upward in almost imperceptible tremors. You do not need to lean closer to feel it. It is already there. Your breathing settles into a slower cadence. The inhalation lengthens. The exhalation releases without pause. The rhythm of your body and the rhythm of the tide no longer feel separate. They move alongside one another. You continue walking, though the movement feels less like progression and more like continuation. The promenade holds you within its curve. The sea holds its steady rise. The sky lowers further into its darkened tone. A faint metallic ring from somewhere behind you taps lightly once against the railing, a small, contained sound. It does not repeat. The night absorbs it easily. Your steps remain even. There is no sense of arrival, only this gradual deepening. The boundary between walking and being here begins to soften, not dramatically, not in a way that calls attention to itself, just enough that the act of moving feels less like something you are doing and more like something unfolding around you. The tide rises, your breath eases. The lamps glow quietly along the curve of the shore, and you remain within that widening hush, carried not forward, but inward into the steady, patient rhythm of water meeting stone and falling away again. The promenade continues, and so do you. By now, the rhythm of walking has dissolved into something quieter than intention. Your steps are not purposeful. They are simply the next gentle contact between soul and stone. The tide has reached a fullness that feels almost complete, the water holding itself higher against the wall before easing back again. Each wave arrives rounded. Each retreat feels deliberate. The motion does not build toward anything. It settles into repetition. You move farther along the curve until the promenade narrows into a quieter stretch where the lamps are spaced wider apart. The intervals of shadow grow longer. Between them, your body feels less defined, not hidden, simply less outlined. There is something calming about being partially unlit. The water now sits only inches below the top of the lower stones. You can see where it presses against the seams, filling the smallest gaps before sliding free. A faint line of foam gathers along the base and thins again, leaving no mark. Nothing is kept. Nothing needs to be. You pause at another low wall that curves outward toward the water. This one is edged with a thin metal strip dulled with age. A small nick interrupts its smooth line, a mark so shallow it might have been made by a ring or the corner of a tool long ago. Your fingers hover over it, then rest lightly. The metal is cooler now. The warmth of the day has fully withdrawn. Your skin adjusts without resistance. The temperature difference disappears within a breath or two. There's something reassuring about how quickly the body adapts. The tide reaches its highest point. For a moment, the water remains level with the edge of the stone, neither rising nor falling. It holds itself there in a quiet suspension, as though pausing to consider its own stillness. You feel that pause too. Your breathing slows. The sky above has deepened into a shade, so dark it no longer feels like color at all. It feels like depth. The stars have multiplied, though not sharply. They appear as softened glimmers, small and steady, scattered across the wide expanse. You do not trace them. You allow them to exist without naming. A boy farther out blinks again, a low pulse of red this time, faint but persistent. The light lingers for a heartbeat before fading back into the dark. You wait through the darkness that follows, then it returns. The pattern is slow enough that it does not create anticipation. It becomes part of the larger rhythm. You step away from the wall and continue walking. The sound of your steps is softer now, absorbed by the dampness in the air. The promenade curves again, and with it the shoreline shifts slightly. The inlet feels broader from this angle, as though the space has quietly expanded. You notice the expansion. It does not overwhelm you, it feels like breathing out. The tide begins its retreat, not suddenly, not dramatically. Just a subtle lowering, a gradual thinning of contact between water and stone. The foam line dissolves first, breaking into fragments before disappearing entirely. The sound shifts from rounded pressure to a softer glide. Inhale, exhale. The water draws back. Your body responds with its own gentle release. The breeze has lessened now, or perhaps you have grown accustomed to it. The air rests against your skin with even pressure. The faint scent of salt lingers, threaded with something cooler, a hint of night settling fully into place. You pass another bench, this one facing outward toward the water. Its paint has peeled slightly along the armrest, revealing the darker wood beneath. A small curl of paint lifts at the edge, no longer attached but not yet fallen. It remains there quietly. You do not disturb it. There's something steadying about small imperfections that ask for nothing. The promenade narrows further, almost becoming a simple walkway now. The railing disappears, replaced by a low stone edge that feels older, less deliberate in its construction. The stones are uneven here, their surfaces worn smooth by countless tides and footsteps. You slow without deciding to. The water continues its retreat, exposing more of the lower stones. They glisten faintly in the lamplight, reflecting small, irregular shapes that shimmer and fade as the water slides past them. You stop walking, not because you have reached a destination, but because the rhythm has shifted. The sea breathes out. You stand still and feel your own breath lengthen. There is no need to match the water exactly. It is enough to notice. A faint tapping sound reaches you, perhaps a loose rope brushing lightly against a mooring post somewhere beyond the curve. The sound repeats once, then settles. It does not demand investigation. It joins the rest of the night. You close your eyes for a moment. The darkness behind them feels no different from the darkness before them. The world continues without requiring your sight. The tide continues to lower. The breeze moves softly across the inlet. You remain. Your body feels less separate from the environment now. The distinction between air and skin, between sound and hearing, has softened. The boundary is still there, but it no longer feels sharply drawn. You open your eyes again. The promenade stretches quietly ahead. A faint mist has begun to gather above the water, so thin it might be imagined. It hovers just above the surface, catching a small amount of light before thinning into nothing. The tide continues its retreat. The sound has become lighter, more of a whisper than a hush. The water glides along the stones, tracing familiar paths as it lowers. A small eddy forms briefly near the base of the wall, circling once before smoothing out. Nothing lingers long. You begin walking again, but now the movement feels less like forward motion and more like drifting within a space that holds you easily. The promenade does not feel like a path to follow. It feels like part of the shoreline itself, an extension of the curve that guides water and wind alike. There's something about repetition that steadies the mind. The tide rises and falls. Steps move and pause. Light brightens and dims. You pass beneath another lamp. Its glow is softer now, diffused slightly by the faint mist. The halo appears larger, less defined at the edges. Your shadow stretches briefly along the stone, then dissolves as you move beyond the light. It leaves no trace. The inlet is quieter now. The earlier sounds of distant activity, a faint engine, a door closing somewhere across the water have faded. What remains is the steady, continuous breath of the sea and the almost imperceptible hum of night settling into itself. You walk until the promenade reaches a small break in the wall where a narrow set of steps descends toward the water. The lower steps are damp from the tide's earlier reach. They gleam faintly in the dim light. You do not descend. You remain at the top. The steps do not call you downward. They simply exist, offering the possibility without expectation. You rest your hand lightly against the stone beside them. The surface is smooth where countless hands have done the same. A shallow groove marks the edge, worn over time, softened by touch. It holds a memory of contact. You lift your hand and continue walking. The tide has lowered enough now that the waterline feels farther away. The exposed stones appear darker, heavier in tone. Small pools remain between them, reflecting tiny fragments of starlight that tremble and blur. The breeze shifts slightly, carrying a cooler edge. Your breath deepens. The promenade straightens into its final stretch before curving out of sight. The lamps here are fewer still. The darkness between them is fuller, less interrupted. You move through it easily. There is no need to rush toward the next light. The sea continues its steady withdrawal, though you know it will return again in its own time. The cycle does not require your awareness to continue. It unfolds regardless. You slow once more, feeling the rhythm of the tide now less as sound and more as presence. The water moves, the air moves, your breath moves. The distinctions blur gently. A final buoy blinks in the distance, a pale white light this time, softer than before. It holds for a moment, then disappears. You find yourself standing still again. The promenade feels less like a path now, and more like a quiet extension of the shoreline, a place that allows you to remain without purpose. The tide lowers further. Your shoulders ease. There is no sense of arrival, no conclusion forming, only this gradual deepening into a space that continues without needing to resolve itself. The sea exhales. You remain within its steady rhythm, less observer now, and more participant in the quiet exchange between water and stone, light and shadow, breath and air. The promenade does not end. It simply curves beyond sight, and you stand within that curve, held by the widening hush as the tide recedes and the night gathers more fully around you. The promenade does not change, and yet something within it has shifted. You begin walking again, though the movement now feels less like travel and more like continuation. The tide has drawn back far enough that the exposed stones glisten in long, dark bands. The water no longer presses against the wall. It moves at a slight distance, breathing in its own wide rhythm. The space between you and the sea has widened. It feels spacious, not empty. The lamps behind you glow in smaller halos now. Their light does not stretch as far. The darkness between them gathers gently, holding its own shape. As you move through that darker stretch, the outlines of things soften, the edge of the wall, the curve of the shoreline, even the sense of your own silhouette. Your steps grow quieter. The sound of sole against stone is almost absorbed by the damp air. You notice how the body adapts to the dimness, pupils widening, shoulders lowering, attention loosening its grip on detail. There's something steadying about a place that does not compete for your focus. The water has begun to reveal a lower ledge along the edge of the inlet. It is narrow and slightly uneven, carved over time by repetition rather than intention. A faint line of darker algae marks the height the tide reached earlier. Below it, the stone appears newly uncovered, darker, and more reflective. You pause near a section where the lower ledge is visible. A shallow indentation has collected a thin ribbon of water, not yet fully withdrawn. It trembles lightly as the next small wave glides in and recedes again. It will empty soon. There is no urgency in that knowing. The breeze shifts once more, moving along the promenade instead of across it. It brushes lightly against your back, as though encouraging no direction in particular, simply reminding you that air continues to move whether you do or not. You turn slightly, facing more fully toward the water. The inlet feels wider now that the tide has retreated. The far shore appears a little more distant, its lights dimmed further by the growing night. Reflections that once stretched brightly across the surface have shortened, breaking into softer, scattered fragments. Light loses its reach without complaint. The mist that hovered earlier has thinned, rising slightly above the water before dissolving into the darker air. The sky overhead has deepened further still. The stars appear steadier now, less filtered by the remaining glow of day. You do not search for constellations. You let the sky remain unmeasured. A faint metallic click sounds behind you, perhaps a railing contracting as the temperature drops, or a distant gate settling into its frame. The sound is singular, contained. It does not repeat. It folds into the quiet. You resume walking. The promenade begins to curve more noticeably here, bending gently along the natural shape of the inlet. As you follow that curve, the angle of the shoreline shifts again. What was once directly before you now rests slightly to your side. Perspective adjusts. You adjust with it. The space feels less linear now, less like a path and more like a wide arc. Your movement traces that arc slowly, your steps aligning with the shape of the land rather than cutting across it. There is something calming about following a curve that has always existed. The tide continues to lower. The sound has become more delicate, less rounded surge, more subtle glide. You can hear the faint drag of water slipping across the newly exposed stone, then easing back again. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm remains steady, though softer now. You pass another bench set slightly back from the wall. Its wooden slats hold the faintest sheen from the cooling air. One slat near the center bears a small groove, as though someone once pressed a key or coin into the surface and turned it absent-mindedly while sitting. The groove is shallow, almost invisible. You notice it because the light catches it at just the right angle. Then you move on. There is no need to linger. The promenade widens briefly, opening into a small semicircular space where the stone wall dips lower. From here, the view of the inlet feels unobstructed. The water, though farther away, still moves with quiet assurance. You step into the center of that small open space. The air feels slightly cooler here, less shielded by the curve of the wall. It rests evenly across your face and hands. Your breath lengthens without effort. There is something about wide space that invites expansion, not of thought, of presence. You stand and let the environment settle around you. The lamps are distant enough now that their glow feels peripheral. The darkness does not crowd. It simply exists, deep, even untroubled. A single ripple moves across the surface of the inlet, catching the faintest glint of starlight before smoothing out again. The motion is so subtle it might be missed if you were looking for something else. But you are not. You are simply here. The tide has reached a lower point now, exposing more of the lower stones. Small patches of wet sand appear between them, dark and smooth. The waterline curves gently, following the contour of the inlet. There is no sharp boundary, only a gradual transition from water to stone to walkway. You feel a similar gradualness within yourself. The distinction between standing and resting feels less pronounced. The act of observing feels less separate from the act of being. You begin walking again, though the movement now feels less like intention and more like continuation of the tide's rhythm. Your steps fall into a slower cadence, matching the softened sound of water against stone. There is no need to maintain pace. The promenade narrows again beyond the semicircle, guiding you back into a quieter stretch. The lamps are fewer still here, spaced widely enough that darkness dominates. Your shadow becomes indistinct. You move through the dimness without hesitation. There is something comforting about the way the body navigates low light, trusting memory of space more than sight. The tide continues its retreat, though you sense it will soon reach its lowest point. The rhythm remains unchanged in character, steady, cyclical, patient. You walk until the curve of the promenade brings you almost back toward where you began, though from a slightly different angle. The inlet feels both familiar and subtly altered. Perspective does that. It softens certainty. You rest your hand again along the stone wall. The surface feels cooler now, having fully released the warmth of day. The temperature difference is noticeable at first, then dissolves within a breath. There's something grounding about contact that requires no adjustment beyond presence. A faint, distant engine hum drifts across the water, low and steady. It remains for several seconds before fading completely. It does not disturb the quiet, it passes through it. You remain still. The waterline lowers another inch. The lower stones gleam faintly in the starlight. Your breathing feels wide and unhurried. The promenade does not demand that you complete its curve. It offers itself as a place to remain, to stand, to walk, to pause without expectation. You notice how the body no longer feels like a separate weight carried through space. It feels more like part of the environment itself, another steady presence within the curve of shore and sky. The breeze thins further. The air grows more still. The tide reaches its lowest point and holds there briefly. You feel that stillness too, not as suspension, but as fullness. A moment where movement pauses without tension. Then, almost imperceptibly, the water begins its return, not in surge, in subtle shift. A small wave glides forward, touching the lowest stone before easing back again. The cycle has turned. You remain within it, not outside, not apart. Just present as the rhythm changes direction, as the water gathers itself once more beneath the deepening night. The first returning wave is almost modest. It does not surge, it tests. A thin sheet of water glides forward across the lowest stones, touching surfaces it had only just revealed. The contact is quiet, deliberate, without urgency. Then it eases back again, leaving a darker sheen behind. The tide has turned. You do not feel it as an event. You feel it as continuation. Your body registers the subtle shift, not as alarm, not as anticipation, but as alignment. The rhythm that had been lengthening outward now begins to gather inward again. The air carries a slightly denser quality, as though the inlet has drawn a deeper breath. You remain near the low wall, watching the change without measuring it. There's something steadying about cycles that do not require attention to function. Another wave arrives, slightly fuller this time. It rounds over the exposed ledge and lingers a fraction longer before receding. The sound is softer than earlier in the evening, less hollow, more absorbed by the cooling air. You notice how the water now seems to carry the darkness with it. Where it spreads across the stone, it deepens the tone, smoothing edges and reducing contrast. The world grows less defined, not blurred, just less sharply outlined. You begin walking again, though the movement feels less like departure and more like gentle repositioning within the curve of shore and tide. The promenade underfoot remains steady. The slight dampness in the air rests against your skin evenly, without insistence. Your steps fall into a rhythm that mirrors the returning water. Forward, pause, return. There is no need to synchronize precisely. It is enough that the patterns echo one another. The lamps behind you glow dimmer still as the night settles fully. Their halos no longer attempt to reach the water. They simply hold small circles of warmth along the stone. Between them, darkness gathers with confidence. You move through one of those darker stretches now. The wall beside you is barely visible. Your hand brushes against it lightly, confirming its presence through touch rather than sight. The stone is cool, solid, untroubled. There's something comforting about materials that endure without commentary. Ahead, the curve of the promenade opens into another broad section where the wall dips lower. From here, you can see the tides return more clearly. The water slides forward again, reclaiming the lowest stones in increments. Each wave leaves behind a faint tremor of reflected starlight, then smooths out. The boundary between water and shore feels less fixed now. It shifts gently with each breath of the tide, advancing and retreating in quiet negotiation. You stand at the center of this open space once more. The air has grown slightly cooler. Your breath is visible only in the faintest way, if at all. It feels internal rather than expressed. A distant buoy emits a low, muted pulse, not bright, not demanding. It glows briefly and fades. The timing is unhurried enough that you do not anticipate its return. It becomes part of the rhythm. The returning tide advances another few inches. The exposed sand darkens again as it meets the water. The earlier shimmer of starlight on wet stone shifts to a broader, more continuous reflection. You feel the cycle settling back into fullness. The body responds without conscious effort. Your shoulders ease further. The subtle alertness that accompanies exposure, wide horizon, open dark, softens into something steadier. There is no need to watch for change. Change arrives in its own time. You begin to walk again along the curve. The promenade now feels less like a path traced against water and more like a quiet companion to it, two arcs running side by side, each following the natural contour of the land. Your steps grow slower, not because you are tired, because the rhythm has deepened. The water now touches stones it had left earlier. The sound grows slightly rounder again, though still subdued. It presses gently against the wall at the far curve, then eases back. Inhale, exhale. The cycle continues. You notice how the distinction between standing and moving feels less significant now. Even when you walk, the movement feels contained within the larger stillness of the inlet. There's something about repeated return that quiets the mind. The breeze has nearly stilled. Only the faintest current moves across the surface of the water, barely enough to disturb the reflections. The stars above appear steadier now, their light resting quietly on the returning tide. You pause once more at a section where the lower stones are half covered again. The water glides forward, lapping gently against the wall before withdrawing just slightly. You rest your hand against the stone. The temperature difference between skin and surface feels minimal now. The air, the wall, the water all share a similar coolness. There is less contrast, less separation. You are aware of your body, but not sharply. It feels like another quiet presence within the arc of shoreline and sky. A small ripple travels outward from somewhere unseen, perhaps a fish shifting below the surface, perhaps the faint current adjusting. The ripple spreads in a widening circle before dissolving into the larger pattern. You watch it without following its path. The tide continues to gather. Each wave reaches a little higher than the last, though the progression is gradual enough that it feels continuous rather than incremental. The promenade remains unchanged. Its stones hold their position, accepting the proximity of water without tension. There is something deeply calming about structures built to accommodate cycles. You walk again, tracing the curve until the semicircular space begins to narrow back into a straight stretch. The lamps here are sparse. Their light barely reaches the water now. Darkness holds most of the view, but it does not feel empty. It feels full. The returning tide now touches the lower ledge fully. The earlier exposed stones disappear beneath the thin advancing sheet. The sound of contact grows slightly more present, though still rounded and steady. You notice how the body has adjusted to this renewed fullness. The earlier spaciousness of retreat has given way to a sense of gentle enclosure. The water feels closer again, not threatening, simply near. Your breathing mirrors that proximity, deeper, slightly slower, steady. There is no moment where the tide announces its return. It simply continues. You stop walking and allow yourself to remain. The curve of promenade, the wall, the water, the sky, they form a quiet enclosure around you. The stars appear softer now, filtered slightly by the moisture in the air. The buoy pulses once more in the distance. The sound of a rope tapping lightly against wood carries faintly across the inlet. The world continues. You feel less inclined to distinguish between its parts. The boundary between air and water, between wall and shore, between you and the environment, it remains, but lightly. There is no need to name it. The tide advances another inch. Your shoulders lower further. The returning water presses gently against the stones once more, completing the cycle begun earlier in the evening. The sound has grown rounder, more complete. The rhythm is restored, and you remain within it, neither leading nor following, simply present as the water gathers itself beneath the deepening night, and the promenade holds its steady curve beside it. The tide continues its slow return. There is no sudden swell, no dramatic change in sound or motion. The water simply gathers itself more fully, pressing closer to the wall, filling the spaces it had earlier left exposed. The lowest stones are now fully covered, their edges softened beneath a thin, moving sheen. You remain where you are for a moment, allowing the pattern to complete itself without needing to trace each shift. The night has deepened almost imperceptibly. The sky no longer holds color, only depth. The stars rest within it, not sharp, not glittering, but present in a way that feels steady rather than bright. Their light stretches across the surface of the inlet in elongated lines that bend and break gently as the water moves. You do not try to follow those lines. They rearrange themselves without your attention. A wave reaches the wall and presses there lightly, as if testing its boundary. The sound is rounded, hollowed slightly by the curve of stone. Then it recedes, drawing a faint hiss as it slides back over submerged ledges. The rhythm has become more complete now, less spacious, more continuous. You notice that your own breathing has adjusted again, not consciously, but in response to this fullness. Inhale settles into exhale without hesitation. There is no pause between them long enough to register as separation. The promenade beneath your feet feels unchanged, yet your sense of standing upon it has altered. Earlier, when the tide was low, there was a sense of exposure, more space between shore and water, more visible ground. Now that the inlet has filled, the edges feel closer together, though still generous. There's something reassuring about when a cycle closes its arc. You begin walking again along the curve, though the motion feels less like travel and more like gentle drift. Your steps land quietly on the stone. The sound of them is absorbed almost immediately by the thicker air. You pass beneath one of the lamps. Its light no longer attempts to reach the water's surface. Instead, it rests low, creating a contained circle that barely touches the wall. Your shadow, once elongated across the pavement, now appears faint and diffused, dissolving into the darker stretches between lamps. There is less contrast, less delineation. The returning tide presses again against the lower ledge, and this time it remains for a fraction longer before withdrawing. The movement is not hurried, it is patient. The wall beside you feels cool beneath your fingertips. You run your hand lightly along its surface as you walk, feeling the subtle unevenness of stone worn smooth in some places and slightly textured in others. There is a faint scuff near the base, a mark that has likely been there for years, unnoticed by most. It holds no story you need to know, it simply exists. A small ripple spreads outward from the center of the inlet, catching starlight as it moves. The light fractures gently across its surface, then settles again. The water does not resist these small disturbances, it absorbs them. You find that your thoughts behave in a similar way. They arise, they spread, they settle. There is no need to hold on to them. The promenade narrows slightly ahead. The curve becomes more pronounced, guiding you back toward the place where the wall dips lower and the inlet opens more fully to the sky. The tide here feels closer still, its surface now almost level with the midpoint of the stone ledge. The earlier exposed sand has disappeared entirely beneath the returning water. The cycle is nearly complete. You stop at the wider section once more. The openness here feels different now that the inlet has filled. Earlier, it held the quiet spaciousness of retreat. Now it carries the steady presence of return. Neither state feels more significant than the other. They simply alternate. A distant door closes somewhere behind you along the row of houses. The sound travels softly, contained within the night. It does not echo, it does not carry far. It folds into the larger stillness. You lean slightly against the wall, not in weariness, but in ease. The stone supports you without effort. The water below continues its steady rhythm, pressing and easing, pressing and easing. The boundary between wall and water has thinned, but it has not vanished. It remains defined enough to hold structure, yet softened enough that it does not demand attention. You feel something similar within yourself. Your outline has not dissolved, it has simply relaxed. The returning tide reaches a little higher now, touching a section of stone it had not reached earlier in the evening. The sound is slightly fuller. The water lingers before receding. This is the highest point of the cycle for now. It will continue beyond this, perhaps, but you do not need to track it. You stand within its current expression. The stars above appear steadier still. There is no flicker, no movement that can be traced by the eye. They seem less like distant objects and more like quiet presences woven into the depth of the sky. Your breathing remains even. The night air rests against your skin in a way that feels neutral, neither cool nor warm enough to register as contrast. The temperature has found its balance. You begin walking once more, tracing the full curve of the promenade without hurry. Each step feels lighter now, not because you are lifting more deliberately, but because there is less internal tension shaping the movement. You drift rather than stride. The lamps fall behind you one by one, their small halos diminishing as you move into darker stretches. The water continues to press against the wall in its steady pattern, never breaking, never surging. There is something deeply calming about repetition that does not escalate. You notice that you are no longer distinguishing between the sound of the tide and the quiet hum within your own ears. They have blended into a single, continuous presence, low, consistent, almost imperceptible until you listen for it. You do not need to listen for it, it is simply there. The promenade curves back toward the point where you first entered it. The tide has fully reclaimed the inlet now, filling the space with steady movement. The earlier emptiness feels distant, though it was only a short time ago. Cycles compress when observed without urgency. You stop once more near the beginning of the curve. The wall dips slightly here, and the water touches it with soft insistence. The sound is rounded, steady, complete. There is no sense of climax, no culmination, only continuation. Your shoulders ease further, though you had not noticed them held before. Your jaw loosens slightly. Your hands rest easily at your sides. You feel less like a separate figure standing beside water and more like a quiet extension of the shoreline itself, a vertical presence among horizontal lines. The boundary between observer and observed has softened again, but gently without spectacle. You are not merging, you are settling. The tide presses once more against the wall and withdraws. The stars rest above. The lamps remain dim behind you. The world continues in its steady pattern, and you remain within it, neither distinct nor dissolved, simply held within the wide curve of water, and night as the inlet completes its return and the rhythm settles into fullness. The tide has reached its fullness, not in a dramatic cresting, not in any visible threshold crossed. It has simply risen to where it now rests, pressing steadily along the length of the stone wall, moving in small, continuous gestures that require no announcement. You stand within that fullness without needing to mark it as such. The inlet no longer reveals its earlier contours. The shallow channels and exposed ridges have been covered, softened beneath a surface that appears almost seamless from this distance. The water does not flatten entirely. It continues its subtle motion, a rounding, a lifting, a quiet settling back. The sound has deepened. Earlier, it whispered lightly against stone. Now it holds a slightly lower tone, fuller, more sustained. It does not call attention to itself. It simply fills the space between lamps and sky. You begin walking again, though the movement feels less like intention and more like continuation. Your steps fall into the cadence already established: heel, shift, settle. The promenade curves beneath you, its shape now familiar enough that you do not need to look ahead to anticipate it. There's something comforting about a path that requires no decision. The lamps stand evenly spaced along the curve. Their glow feels softer now, perhaps because your eyes have adjusted, perhaps because the night has deepened enough to hold them more gently. Their reflections ripple faintly on the water's surface, stretching and narrowing as the tide presses and withdraws. A ripple forms near the center of the inlet and travels outward in slow, widening rings. It catches starlight for a moment before dissolving back into the larger movement. You do not try to trace its source. Some things move without needing to be explained. The air carries a faint trace of salt and something cooler beneath it, stone that has held water long enough to take on its scent. You breathe it in without effort. The inhale arrives quietly. The exhale leaves without interruption. Your breathing now feels almost indistinguishable from the tide's rhythm. In, out, press, withdraw. The promenade widens slightly where the wall curves inward. You pause there, resting your hands lightly along the stone. The surface feels smooth in some places, faintly textured in others. There is a small notch beneath your palm, not deep, not new, a mark that has been worn by weather and years of contact. It does not tell a story. It simply reminds you that time moves in cycles here too. The tide presses again against the base of the wall, lingering a fraction longer before receding. The sound is rounded, consistent. It does not build. It does not diminish. It continues. You notice that the earlier sense of watching the water has shifted. You are no longer observing its rise or fall. You are standing within its presence, as if the distinction between shore and self has thinned into something softer. Not erased, just less rigid. The sky above holds steady in its depth. The stars do not shimmer sharply. They rest in the darkness as small, consistent points, part of the structure rather than embellishment. Their reflections on the water are blurred, elongated by the surface's motion. You begin to move again along the curve, though now your steps feel lighter, almost as if the ground itself carries a fraction of the weight. The stone beneath your feet remains firm, but your sense of pressing into it has softened. The promenade narrows briefly, guiding you toward the far end of the arc. The tide here presses more directly against the wall. You can hear the water tracing the unevenness of stone, filling small gaps, withdrawing again. The sound has become so steady that it feels less like an event and more like a condition of the night. You pass beneath another lamp. Its light no longer creates sharp contrast. It settles on the stone in a contained circle, barely reaching the water. Your shadow appears only faintly, diffused along the ground before disappearing into darker stretches. You realize you have not felt the need to hurry at any point. There was no arrival to anticipate, no departure to consider. The tide did not rush its return. The night did not accelerate its descent. Everything has unfolded at a pace that required no intervention. There's something deeply settling about that. You stop once more near the midpoint of the promenade. The inlet is now entirely full, its surface gently rounded under the weight of returning water. The earlier emptiness feels distant, almost theoretical. You lean slightly against the wall, not from fatigue, but from ease. The stone supports you without adjustment. The water below continues its quiet conversation with the shore. A faint mechanical hum carries briefly from somewhere along the row of houses behind you, perhaps a heater adjusting, perhaps a distant appliance. It lasts only a moment before folding back into silence. The world maintains itself without needing your attention. You remain within it. The tide presses and eases again. The sound blends seamlessly with the low hum that seems to underlie all stillness at this hour. You can no longer separate the layers of sound. They have gathered into a single, even tone. Your shoulders settle another fraction. Your jaw loosens. Your hands rest easily at your sides. There is no instruction here, no suggestion that you do anything differently. You simply stand. The curve of the promenade now feels like a gentle embrace, a shape that holds the water without constraining it, a boundary that exists without conflict. The tide touches it, withdraws, returns. Nothing resists, nothing insists. The sky has deepened further, though you cannot identify exactly when that shift occurred. The stars appear steadier, less numerous perhaps, or perhaps simply less distinct. The darkness feels uniform, almost velvety in its depth. You begin walking back toward the entrance of the promenade, retracing the arc without conscious choice. The path unfolds beneath you in the same way it did earlier, though now the water sits higher along its edge. Your steps remain even. The sound of them is absorbed quickly. A single bird call carries faintly from somewhere across the inlet, brief, contained, almost swallowed by the air. It does not repeat, it does not echo. It simply marks a small moment before dissolving. You pass the first lamp again, its glow now behind you. The tide continues its steady rhythm along the entire length of the wall. There is no section untouched by its motion. You realize that you no longer feel separate from the movement at all, not because you have disappeared into it, but because it has become the background against which everything else rests. The promenade does not demand that you stay. The tide does not require your presence. The night continues whether you observe it or not. Yet here you are, within it. The fullness of the inlet holds steady. It does not swell higher. It does not recede yet. It simply rests at its peak, pressing lightly against stone, creating a sound that is neither loud nor faint, but consistent. You stop once more at the beginning of the curve. The water continues. The lamps remain. The sky holds its depth. You are already within the rhythm, and there is nothing further required. The tide does not recede immediately. It lingers at its height, pressing lightly against the stone as though considering its own fullness. The surface moves in small, continuous gestures, not restless, not still, a sustained presence that fills the inlet completely. You remain where you are. The promenade curves behind you, its arc familiar now in a way that no longer requires attention. The lamps glow at measured intervals, their light steady, their reflections lengthened slightly by the water's movement. The night has settled into its deeper register. There is no transition to witness. It has already occurred. The air feels cooler along your hands, though not sharply so. The breeze that passes across the water carries only the faintest trace of salt, a suggestion rather than a statement. It brushes your sleeves and moves on, leaving the space unchanged. You begin walking again, but now the movement feels almost weightless. Not because the ground has altered, but because your sense of effort has thinned. Each step arrives and leaves without drawing attention to itself. Heel, shift, release. The tide responds with its own rhythm, pressing softly against the wall before easing away again. It does not pull sharply. It does not announce its retreat. It simply begins to lower by fractions too small to notice at first. The fullness relaxes. You sense it more than you see it. There's something reassuring about a cycle that never rushes either direction. The inlet remains nearly level, but the water's edge has shifted just enough that a narrow band of darker stone begins to reappear along the base of the wall. It glistens faintly, newly revealed, but not dramatically so. You stop midway along the promenade and rest your hand lightly on the stone again. It feels cooler than before, touched repeatedly by water and air. Beneath your palm, you notice a faint line in the stone, perhaps a natural seam, perhaps the remnant of an old repair. It does not interrupt the surface. It simply exists. The water continues its quiet exchange below. The sky remains vast and even. The stars do not brighten further, they simply hold their places. The darkness around them feels softer now, as though the night has settled fully into itself. You realize that the earlier sense of scale, the breadth of the inlet, the curve of the promenade, the stretch of sky, has grown less significant, not smaller, just less defined. The edges have softened. Your breathing remains steady. In, out, the tide lowers another fraction. The sound changes subtly, not in volume but in tone. Where earlier it pressed firmly against the wall, it now traces the stone more lightly, creating a thinner sound, a quieter contact. It finds its level. You walk once more toward the entrance of the promenade, though the movement feels less like departure and more like continuation. The path does not signal an ending, it simply extends. There is no moment that declares the cycle complete. The water recedes gradually, exposing more of the darkened stone along the wall. Small rivulets slide downward, returning to the larger body of water in slender threads. They glimmer briefly under lamplight before disappearing. A distant door closes somewhere beyond the houses behind you, a soft, contained sound. It does not echo, it simply marks the persistence of ordinary life beyond the inlet. The world continues. The tide lowers another subtle measure. You pause again near the midpoint, observing how the surface has altered just enough to reveal faint patterns beneath the suggestion of earlier contours, not yet fully defined. The inlet is not empty, nor is it full. It rests somewhere between. There's something calming about that in-between state, not arrival, not departure, simply continuation. The lamps continue to glow without flicker. Their light rests on the promenade stone in quiet pools. The reflections on the water stretch and contract as the surface moves, but the rhythm remains unbroken. Your steps slow further, not from fatigue, from ease. The air grows stiller as the breeze settles. The scent of salt becomes fainter, replaced by the cooler neutrality of night air. You inhale without thinking. The breath arrives softly and leaves in the same way. The tide continues its measured retreat. You notice how little the scene demands from you. It does not ask to be interpreted. It does not ask to be remembered. It simply unfolds. The water now reveals a wider band of stone at the base of the wall. It glistens faintly under lamplight, dark and smooth. A small ripple touches it and withdraws, leaving behind a sheen that slowly dulls as it dries. The inlet surface remains calm, broken only by subtle undulations that carry outward and fade. You rest both hands on the stone again, leaning lightly into its steadiness. The coolness beneath your palms feels grounding, but not anchoring. You could remain here without effort. The night holds its shape. The sky has deepened to a uniform tone, the stars steady and distant. There is no shift in brightness now, only the slow persistence of darkness settling more fully around the edges of things. The tide lowers another small degree. You begin walking back toward the curve's center one last time. The promenade feels unchanged beneath your feet. The arc remains gentle, its shape consistent, its length manageable. The water continues to recede, though, so gradually that it almost appears to hold still. The sound has softened further, thinner now, tracing the stone with a lighter touch. A single ripple moves outward from the inlet's center, catching the faint light before dissolving into the broader surface. You stop. The inlet rests between fullness and exposure, balanced within its own cycle. There is no need to witness the lowest point. The rhythm is understood. The water will continue to withdraw and return long after you have turned away. The promenade will remain. The lamps will hold their glow until they are switched off by unseen hands. The sky will deepen further. You are already within this continuity. The tide lowers another quiet fraction. The sound thins again, though it does not disappear. It remains present, a soft accompaniment to the stillness around it. You step away from the wall now, allowing the space to stand on its own. The inlet does not change because you have moved. The rhythm continues unaffected. There's something deeply comforting about that. The world does not hinge on your presence, it simply includes you. You walk toward the entrance of the promenade without hurry. The curve straightens gradually, leading you back to the wider path beyond. The lamps behind you stretch into a gentle sequence of light, diminishing slightly in brightness as distance increases. The water continues its quiet retreat. The sound grows lighter still, as if settling into the background of the night. You pause once more at the threshold where the promenade meets the broader walkway. From here, the inlet appears smaller, more contained. The exposed stone along the wall is now more visible, though still damp and reflective. The tide will continue to lower. The night will continue to deepen. You do not need to remain to confirm it. You stand for a moment, letting the air rest against your skin. The coolness feels even. Your breathing aligns naturally with the slow rhythm that has carried the entire evening. In, out, there is no ending here, only continuation. The inlet will fill again. The stone will be covered and revealed in its own time. The lamps will glow and fade. The sky will lighten and darken in its patient cycle. You are already within it. The tidal river continues as it always has. Its rhythm remains. You do not need to follow it. You are already within it. The night gathers, the quiet holds, and the rest will carry itself.